O tēnā koutou katoa, ki te whare e tūnei, te papa e tā koutou nei, nā rangatira hoki tēnā koutou. He mihi kawana ki te mana whenua o tēnei rohi, kia koutou mea koutou uri, e muri aki nei tēnā koutou. Tēnei au, te paukoko Māori o tākou whakaihu waka, e mihi atu nei kia koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So I'm Jacinta Ruru, Deputy Vice-Chancellor Māori here at the University of Otago. And on behalf of the senior leadership team, I welcome you all here this evening for this very special event to mark and celebrate the promotion of Professor Angela Wanhalla to our highest academic position. He mihi nunui kia koe e hoa. I acknowledge all our colleagues, visitors here in person and those online who are gathered together to celebrate all Professor Angela Wanhalla has achieved in her remarkable career to this point. This is a special occasion for you, Angela, and for your whānau, hapu and iwi. I especially acknowledge your dear mum this evening, who is joining us online from Christchurch, along with many others from your whānau, your colleagues and friends from afar, here in Aotearoa and overseas. I also acknowledge your partner, Emeritus Professor Lockie Patterson, tēnā koe. This occasion this evening represents years and years of award-winning research, teaching and supervision. And as a kaitahu history scholar, Professor Wanhalla has contributed enormously to new knowledge to this country and internationally. And one of the roles of the university is to help positively transform society. And your work on investigating the complex histories and politics of cross-cultural intimacy in colonial societies, particularly for Indigenous communities in New Zealand and the Pacific, is exemplary and has deservedly led to many recognitions, including Fellow of the Royal Society Te Aparangi. So Professor Wanhalla, you are breaking new ground and revealing new insights and knowledge about who we are as a country. And as your colleague, your research collaborator and dear friend, it is my greatest delight to stand here with you this evening to mark this substantial occasion in your stellar career. I'll now hand over to Associate Professor Francis Steele, Head of the Programme of History, to more fully introduce you. Our warm welcome to you all this evening. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Tēnā koutou katoa. It's my special privilege this evening to introduce Professor Angela Wanhalla, a distinguished scholar of gender, colonialism and interracial intimacies across these islands and the wider Pacific. Angela's work ranges from the context of shore whaling in early 19th century southern New Zealand to global conflict in the mid-20th century in the Pacific theatre of World War II. Angela's academic career commenced at the University of Canterbury, where she completed a BA Honours, a Master's and PhD in history, and where she found, or indeed made a home, at the productive intersection of Māori history and feminist history. Her PhD explored the history of interracial marriage from the 1830s in a community near Dunedin at the Tairi Native Reserve. This was published as her first book, Invisible Sight, The Mixed Descent Families of Southern New Zealand. In September 2005, Angela joined Otago's history program after a year-long postdoctoral stint in Canada. Her time at Otago has been distinguished by a series of significant awards, including the Roheath Trust Award and Carl Smith Medal, and the University of Otago Early Career Award for distinction in research. A particular career highlight was the award in 2013 of a Rutherford Discovery Fellowship from the Royal Society of New Zealand. These 5-year fellowships were awarded annually to 10 future research leaders across New Zealand. In 2021, Angela was elected Fellow of the Royal Society and she was promoted to Professor in 2022. The importance of Angela's research is reflected in a series of external grants, beginning with a Fast Start Marsden grant from the Royal Society in 2007, which supported her work on the history of interracial marriage in New Zealand. This was followed by the award of a Marsden Standard Grant in 2009 with Professor Judy Bennett for their project concerned with the fate of children born of American servicemen and Indigenous women in the South Pacific Command during World War II. And more recently, in 2018, Angela, together with Professor Lockie Patterson, they were awarded a Marsden Standard Grant for Te Hau Kāinga, their project on the histories and legacies of the Māori home front, 1939 to 1945. Angela has a truly formidable record of scholarship. It includes 5 books, several edited collections, and numerous chapters, journal articles, and reviews. Her work represents people's lives in a way that few historians are able to do. Coming from a place of deep personal meaning, it readily resonates with the lives of other New Zealanders, and I'm sure we will hear more about that this evening. I just want to dwell on 2 pieces of her work. Her second book, Matters of the Heart, A History of Interracial Marriage in New Zealand, published by Auckland University Press, was awarded the 2014 Ernest Scott Prize for the book judged to be the most distinguished contribution to the history of Australia or New Zealand or to the history of colonisation. Angela was only the second Dunedin resident to have been awarded this prize since its inception in 1943. The book was widely reviewed as groundbreaking and as an accessible pioneering study, and for one reviewer, it was especially notable that several of their own relatives had picked up the copy of the book to see whether their family histories were included, attesting to the resonance and reach of Angela's scholarship. Her most recent book, Of Love and War, was published last year by the University of Nebraska Press and concerns the many hundreds of New Zealand and Pacific war brides who married American servicemen during World War II. Stories that illuminate the impact of global war on local women, their families, and Pacific societies. Another notable feature of Angela's work that I just want to highlight is its collaborative quality. And this again, I think, will be an emphasis of her lecture this evening. As one of her co-authors reflected to me, she found writing together with her a formative experience in her academic career, one shaped by intellectual friendship and encouragement. So ka whakamihi au ki a koe, mō tēnei taumata. My congratulations to you, Angela. And all that remains for me is to invite you to the podium to deliver your IPL entitled Whānau, Whenua and History. Kia ora.
Ka mihi niwi ki ngā mana whenua, kia kaitahu ka te mamoe me waitaha. Ka mihi nui ngā rangatira o tākou whakaihu waka. I like saying that. Ka mihi au ki ngā whānau o Ngāti Moki no Taumutu. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. So I have to admit that I've been doing my best to delay having to do this thing. Really hard. I've been working really hard to do that. And I'm glad I did because I now get to deliver my presentation under the banner of o tākou whakaihu waka, but also under the mana of the inaugural DVC Māori. So I think that's a wonderful position to be in giving my IPL. So thank you, Jacinta, for hosting tonight's event and for all the work that you do and have done to advocate for Māori staff, teaching and research here at Otago. And I count myself very lucky to be able to collaborate with you on research and writing projects. And I look forward to many more, I hope. I'd also like to just begin by acknowledging a few other people before I launch into tonight's presentation. I'd like to acknowledge my past and present postgraduate students, some of whom I know are online, and just say that I'm proud of you and all of your achievements to date. I look forward to seeing all the many books that you produce in the future. And I want to particularly acknowledge Dr. Katie Cooper, whose first book will be published. She was a graduate of ours on the 7th of August in Unity Books. So go along, and if you're in Wellington, go and support Katie. Barbara Brooks will be launching it. It's on the history of the rural kitchen. It's going to be fantastic. It's beautifully illustrated. So well done, Katie. I know she's online and she'll be annoyed that I'd said that. Thank you to the history program. I've benefited from being in a program with a really strong research culture that supports research grant applications. You've heard about some of them. They've been introduced tonight, and we'll be talking a bit more about them. And taking risks in research and having ambition. So I think it's really wonderful to be in a program where that is supported. And I want to particularly thank Barbara Brooks, former colleague, now Emeritus Professor, and Judy Bennett for their mentorship, two people I've kind of collaborated with throughout my career. And finally, Lockie. Thank you for being my greatest supporter and advocate. I'm a bit biased, but I do consider Lockie one of our best historians of Māori print culture in this country, and I'm really pleased that the university recognised this in making him an Emeritus Professor last year. I think the university is pretty lucky to have him, as am I. So thank you very much, Lockie. You'll be hearing more about Lockie later. So tonight's talk is in two parts. The first part just briefly touches on my whānau, mainly to give you a bit of a sense of the people and the places that have shaped me and informed my research trajectory. As has been indicated, a lot of my work is very personal, and it also reaches people personally as well, which I recognise. In the second part, I'll highlight some projects I've really enjoyed being a part of, and that has a lot to do with the people I've worked with. So this is really an opportunity to acknowledge those people and thank them for including me in their projects, which have really enriched my career and particularly my intellectual life. So thank you very much to everyone. I won't get to mention everyone tonight. There's been lots of collaborations in my career, but I'm just going to highlight a few that have been a lot of fun for me. So much of my research is centred on cross-cultural histories and families in 19th and 20th century New Zealand, and my interest in those areas have been shaped by a person and a place, the person being my dad, Stan, and this place, Taumotu. This is an image of the Hone Weteri Church, located not far from our marae. It's a very windswept spot, as you can see, but that's quite a nice day. It's not always like that. And it's located reasonably close to the ocean. You can probably see a few of the sandbanks, the dunes in the background. I love going visiting here. My dad's buried here. He died in 2005, just a few months after I graduated with my PhD and before I started a job here in September that year. So I'm kind of standing near him, taking a picture on that day. And it's really lovely. It's lovely and quiet, and you can hear the birds and you can hear the ocean. It's just beautiful. So if you get a chance to visit, go and have a look and say hello to my dad. Now, Taumotu is historically important for many reasons, but I'll highlight just a few. First, it's strongly connected to Ōtākau through the Tairoa Allison whānau and through the Ruahikihiki hapu. And the fact that HK Tairoa, the representative of the Southern Māori electorate, settled there in the late 1870s. We operated a farm and built a house, Awhitu. His wife Tini and some of their sons are buried at this urupa. Now the Tairoa and Allison whānau have held significant leadership positions at Taumotu for many, many years. Of particular importance to our family is a man called Ricky Allison. You can see his grave here in the picture. He helped my parents get access to support from Māori Affairs to get a mortgage in the days when you could get that kind of support. And they would never have got into their own home otherwise without him. And he always thought that Ricky Allison was the man, God, king of it all. And he always reminded us just how important he was and how much we owed to him and Taumotu, and to always go back there. And the reason why he wanted to be buried there as well. The other reason that Taumotu is important is that not far from this church is a small cluster of little buildings on a piece of land known as Fisherman's Point. And as a kid, I was always quite fascinated by this community. I think it began to be settled in the late 19th or early 20th century, mainly by men who worked in the fishing industry. They were from Italy, Russia, Greece, Denmark, and Sweden, and many other exotic places. And I was very intrigued and interested in why they were there in this place. If you don't know where Taumatu is, on the southern point really of Te Waihora, Lake Ellesmere, far, far away from the rest of the world, fairly isolated as well, and why they stayed as well. And that's partly to do with the families that they married into, which were both the farming families in this region, but also many people who affiliate to Ngāti Moki marae too. And those descendants of those families are people my dad grew up with and who he talked about quite a lot. So I lived with these people throughout my life, and had to follow him around all the time, going and visiting people and listening to kind of old people talking constantly, and I just was bored out of my mind. But he sucked me into history by doing that. Combined with this, the fact my own family comes from quite a diverse cultural background also shaped my interest in cross-cultural couples and families. So in my work, as has been mentioned, I explore the economic, social and cultural consequences of colonialism for Indigenous women, their families and communities. And I've done this by examining the history of interracial marriage, and I've done that for personal reasons. My mum is Pākehā, of Irish and Manx heritage, and my dad is Māori and carries a really weird surname, Wanhalla, which is from Finland. So here are my parents on their wedding day on the 1st of May 1970, standing outside the Christchurch Registry office. My mum is 17 here and looks amazing. She knew she looked amazing. Yeah. Check out my dad's monobrow. It's pretty cool. It disappeared in later life. I don't know what happened. So my mum, her name is Coralie, is from an Irish Catholic background in Christchurch. Her father, Mike Noonan, is the man there with his shirt way open for some reason. Grew up in a kind of Irish Catholic family, is one of 13 kids. They grew up around the Richmond area in Christchurch. He was a really big league player, loved rugby league, really into it. Really kind of wasn't interested in Catholicism and gave it up as soon as he possibly could. His interests were mainly communism, working class politics and reading people's voice was the key thing. And working class politics in particular was big for him. I never met his wife, my grandmother Nairi, who's the woman on the right. As she died in February 1968, Auckland Hospital, aged just 48. She'd had a kidney transplant 3 months earlier and her body rejected it. At that point, to have had that operation, you had to go to Auckland. So the whole family moved there to be with her. And Nairi's death changed the trajectory of my mother's life. She was my mum, second oldest of 6 kids. And when the family returned to Christchurch, it was expected that she leave school, just like her older sister, get a job and contribute to the family economy and look after the younger kids, and that's exactly what she did. But it didn't take long for her to get married at 17 here. Also in the picture there is my dad's parents, Bill Hamilton Wanhalla, who is a fisherman and farm labourer, and his wife, Waitai Brown, who I'm going to talk about very, very soon. So my mum, like my father, left school without any qualifications. Dad grew up in the Prebbleton and Broadfields area, so if you know Christchurch, reasonably around, kind of out on the outskirts of Hornby. And the family worked on local farms and moved from farm to farm for employment. And they also engaged in fishing at Te Waihora, Lake Ellesmere. So my dad, and I have to say honour my grandmother here, is the 5th child of 15. So a massive family, and came from quite a bit of kind of a poor background, a reasonably poor background. He ended up working at Islington Freezing Works on the chain, eventually getting a permanent position there, highly prized permanent position. But during the off-season, he worked as a truck driver, sheet metal worker, and a range of kind of other jobs until he got a permanent job. Here are some more family photos for you. My dad and my mum at their flat in 1973. My dad's put on some weight there. He was truck driving that year. I don't know why they're hanging out in front of the laundry line at all. But you can see their laundry. See my brother with some gravel. Mark is his name. And me and my sister, Crystal, You can tell it's the 1980s because brown was the colour of the decade. And also, I don't know how we lived in that house with so many different patterns. So we come from a fairly working class family. But in 1988, everything changed. In July that year, the freezing works at Islington were closed. Dad lost his job and he never worked again. He was 45 years old. He eventually got rheumatoid arthritis and was on the sickness benefit. One good thing to come out of the redundancy was that my parents used it to pay off their mortgage, a very sensible thing to do. But generally, the 1990s were a pretty tough decade for them, involving a lot of financial stress because we relied on the beneficiary system to survive. And at a time, if people can remember back to the 1990s, some of you might be too young for this, when the national government targeted beneficiaries, really stigmatised the being on a benefit if you were a family on a benefit as well, and were deeply targeted and kind of cut away at our welfare system. So this is the context in which I kind of started university in the mid-1990s, from a kind of background of kind of deep concern, I guess, about our political situation, but also of poverty as well. It was a really tough time for my family. So these come from papers past. Christchurch Press is available to 1989. You can find out all about my family if you go online. It's a lot of interesting things to find out. The part of the reason I'm showing it is because the image that was on the front page is actually, thank God, they don't do images very well on papers past and they're really grainy, but that front page has got me and my brother, my sister and my dad in the picture. This was at a big meeting with the union about redundancy packages, trying to get a better deal, and all the families came. It was on a Saturday. And you can kind of see my dad's nose at the edge, and my brother sitting right at the front in the middle in his Canterbury Bulldogs jumper, because we were really big fans of the Canterbury Bulldogs rugby league team. League was everything, and softball as well were kind of two big games for our family. So I started university in the mid-90s, and so for my family, from this context, education was about getting out of poverty and having opportunities for a better life, and for opportunities that my parents didn't get to have. My father, as I said, I think left work at 15, and my mother at kind of a similar age, left school at 15, and my mother at a similar age as well. So as Francis has mentioned, I ended up carrying on at university, exploring postgraduate options. I ended up doing my Masters on the eugenics movement and feminism in interwar New Zealand, then a PhD under the supervision of Katie Pickles and Parsonson. I have to thank them both for encouraging me into postgraduate research, particularly Katie. She was the one that really encouraged me to kind of continue on. And also for telling me that doing your doctorate on your own family, which is what I ended up doing, and on whakapapa was a legitimate research topic and methodology. So I really owe them a great deal, and they really kind of shaped my research trajectory. So my doctoral research was not on Taumatu though. Too much family politics there, not a good idea. But those families who made their lives on the Tairi Native Reserve, which has been mentioned, located on the northern bank of the Tairi River in this province, where my family has links. In the 1830s, there was a shore whaling station operating at Motarata Island off the coast of the Tairi Mouth, and many of those men had Māori wives and ended up living at the reserve. And I was really interested in the circumstances upon which these relationships were forged, the kinds of households they formed, and their social, emotional and cultural dynamics. And I've argued in my work that it's Indigenous women who are central to these histories, but that their experiences, at least until recent decades, have often been the kind of side story to the main plotline of the emergence of new trade and strategic and political relationships in the decades before formal colonisation. But the whaling trade was built upon foundations made possible by Māori women and their kin. So I've sought in my work to whakamana the woman who was central to founding cross-cultural communities, and focus in particular on the role of marriage as a common strategy of Indigenous diplomacy across the southern Pacific. And I've tried to counter some of the earlier historiography that's focused on trade relations alone, often without considering the Indigenous worlds in which these men entered and operated within, and the historiography that often overlooked or marginalised gender and the family, which have been kind of core themes in my research. The image you see here is of me and my dad at PhD graduation in Christchurch when I had dark hair, less wrinkles, weighed less. You can tell that my dad does not like wearing a tie. He's kind of had enough. He's kind of got to the end of the day and this is not can't cope anymore. And the cover of my first book, Invisible Sight. So the people on that cover, the little girl is my dad's grandmother, who he never met, and she's sitting with her grandmother, who were from the Tairi Native Reserve. And thank you to Dave Brown for sharing these images with me while I was doing my PhD research. So what we see in the southern regions is that the nature and the pattern of interracial marriage often echoed forms of gendered authority and leadership in kaitohu communities. In cultures where women of rank exercised power and authority, they had the freedom to choose to engage in marriage with traders and to gain advantage from the economic and social opportunities marriage provided, both personally and collectively. Shore-whaling stations operated in a kaitohu world and on kaitohu terms, as simple as that. And cross-cultural couples and households operated mainly with Indigenous aspirations in mind. They absorbed traders into their genealogies. They were kind enough to do that. These relationships brought new members into kaitohu communities and encumbered these men with responsibilities to their kin, which included the sharing of goods and wealth. And even as colonisation and increased land alienation reshaped the economic and political landscape, many families, as Kate Stevens and I have kind of explored, remained well connected with their kaitohu relations, reflecting the enduring strength of kaitohu culture and lifeways in this part of the world. It didn't disappear, and these families give us a really wonderful opportunity to explore that in detail and depth and in intimate ways. So my doctorate became my first book, Invisible Sight, and it's underpinned by a desire to focus on kaitohu history through the stories of our women, who had been so critical to the fortunes of our iwi through the relationships they forged with sealers and whalers in the 1820s and 1830s. Kaitohu whānau know these stories and histories. I'm not trying to tell them something they already know. They are not new to them. My purpose really is to bring those stories into a wider frame, to a wider audience as well, to shift some of the historiographical debates, and to raise the status in the historical record, and to give priority to those women and their stories. Instead of focusing on the sealers and whalers, I've argued instead that it was these women who gave them, those men, mana and standing. Now, I'm probably most associated with research on race and intimacy and colonialism, this kind of work here. But for most of my career at Otago, at least since 2010, I've worked on the Second World War, which Francis has mentioned. Thank you for doing so. Addressing its impact on Indigenous families and communities through a sequence of projects, starting with Mother's Darlings, which Francis talked about so beautifully. Now, this project totally changed the focus of my research and led me into Pacific history, an area that I didn't know that well. So Mother's Darlings was a collaborative project led by our former colleague Judy Bennett, and hi Judy, I know she's online, and it drew upon her lifetime of work in Southern Pacific history. It addressed the social impacts of American forces stationed in the South Pacific Command area on Indigenous communities specifically, and looking at particularly at the children they fathered with Indigenous women and what happened to these children and their mothers. And it was a kind of archival and oral history project with descendants of these relationships, which raised lots of big ethical issues. I want to thank Judy for including me in the project. My job was to work on the New Zealand side of the story. This really changed everything for me. This was one of these kind of transformative moments. I want to thank Judy in particular because I learnt a lot from her about how to work collaboratively, how to do that well. I learnt a lot about research leadership and ambition, how to care for a research team and researchers, and also how to manage a research team as well. So Judy has been a really kind of beacon for me in terms of my research. Part of my job in this project was to be sent off to do the archival research at College Park in Maryland in the United States. And in doing that research, it revealed just how important managing marriage and intimate relationships was to military strategy during World War II. Their archival experience of working through consular records from Suva and New Zealand, and of working with the American Red Cross records as well, encouraged me to think about a project on marriage, race and intimacy in the South Pacific during World War II, which is the book you see on the screen here. So that led to a book, Pacific War Brides, which was published last year with the University of Nebraska Press. This book focuses on the 1,655 women from New Zealand, Tonga, Fiji, Samoa and the Cook Islands who married American servicemen, and the social impact of these men on the communities that hosted them during the war. Given the length of time American forces spent on the rear bases in the South Pacific, building positive social relationships with local people and officials was critical to the success of the military occupation, especially in locations where there was often little else to do but get to know the locals. Marriage interested military command because it impinged on military efficiency, and so they sought to regulate access to it. And how they did that is told in Of Love and War. The fact that just 1,655 American servicemen successfully contracted legal marriage in the South Pacific Command shows that marital opportunities were heavily regulated in the region. And I emphasise legal marriage because there was plenty of customary relationships that were formed under customary terms. One advantage of having that smallish number is that you can actually track a cohort of people across the available archival records, and thanks to digitisation we can do so much more in terms of these following data sets. So that means that the fate of the war marriages themselves can also be assessed, which hadn't been done until that point in terms of New Zealand historiography. So one of my goals in Of Love of War was to kind of try and track the fate of those relationships, what happened to those couples post the war being over. So what we find is that in terms of marriage, not all couples had equitable access. Not that surprising. Race was a key factor in this. Military marriage regulations required a commanding officer refer to the state law in the US when it came to marriage of an American serviceman. So if an American was from Arizona, you referred to the marriage law in Arizona. It didn't matter that wherever that American serviceman was around the world, they embodied their state law. And that was a time when 29 states had laws prohibiting interracial marriage in the United States, plus a federal immigration policy that denied entry to those who could not meet the race-based requirements set out under nationality laws. You had to be 51% or more white to get in to the United States, to get across the border. And the consular records that are held for Fiji and elsewhere that I looked at have charts, whakapapa charts, trying to figure out people's blood quantum, finding out whether someone's 60% white or not. So their records were really amazing and shocking at the same time. Of the 1,655 war brides, at least 60 non-European women married American servicemen during the course of the Pacific War. 4 of those brides were from Tonga, 1 was from the Cook Islands, 5 were from Fiji, 6 were Samoan, another was of Niuean heritage, and the vast majority were Māori from New Zealand. And grooms were from very diverse cultural and ethnic backgrounds as well. One was a Filipino-American, another an Indigenous man. There were many servicemen who were first-generation Americans of German, Polish, Finnish, Norwegian and Russian parentage who came from homes where those were the languages that they spoke. That was their first language, as well as Italian and Mexican Americans as well. Now, African American servicemen were often denied the necessary permission to marry. They were the ones that had the least success. And in fact, only 3 African American servicemen grooms have been identified in the project that I was doing, and they all married Māori women. So in the island Pacific, no African American servicemen received permission to marry at all. And these couples were not able to reunite after the war either. And the records I looked at showed the reasons why. Very sad stories too. And of those 1,655 couples from this total cohort, 73% chose the United States as their home. How couples fared depended upon a whole range of factors, including their new homes, the openness of family in the community, and their personal attributes such as outlook on life and the ability to build new social bonds. Homesickness and loneliness were part of the war bride experience, no matter what country they originated from. But these feelings were exacerbated by the fact that war brides were a particular kind of migrant who often left their home countries reluctantly rather than seeking opportunity in a new place. So they were leaving behind their families, and it was a hard thing to do for them. And in the oral histories I did with some of those families and surviving war brides really emphasised the kind of emotional wrench that was to leave families behind at a time when you weren't sure whether or not you were going to be able to come back home to visit at all, and when like an international phone call was really unusual and cost a lot of money too. So I love these women. They were risk takers and adventurers. I love doing some research on this, and I really kind of find them an amazing group of women who took massive risks in their life and on strangers, virtual strangers really. So women's experiences on arriving at their new homes varied. If they ended up in a small town like Ngārita, they were an exotic and novel presence. Ngārita left the familiarity of urban life in Wellington for a rural community in life as sharecroppers on a tobacco farm in Kentucky. So a radically different kind of experience. Among people who were strangers and as the only foreign war bride in the community, so stuck out like a sore thumb as well. And I got the opportunity to speak with Ngārita's children when I visited Kentucky to hear about her story. Rekanui, by contrast, enjoyed moving to a much larger city compared to Georgetown, Kentucky. And this was also, her transition was helped by a very outgoing personality. I think you can see this here. Happily for her, she ended up in Los Angeles, which is exactly where she wanted to be. She ended up, her and her husband John lived with her mother-in-law for a short period of time, but they couldn't get along. They didn't like each other very much, and they ended up deciding on living on a trailer located across from a beach at Pacific Coast Highway, which you see here, and Rekanui doing her best to be as glamorous as possible. During the war, Rekanui performed at American camps and hospitals and at nightclubs, notably the Silver Slipper on Shortland Street in Auckland. She really enjoyed the war. She had a great time. She made the most of new entertainment opportunities established to cater for the Americans, and she was well known in kind of Auckland circles as the yodeling cowgirl. So she was quite a yodeler. So I met Rekanui over 10 years ago. I got to stay with her for a few days in her house in Oxnard, California. I had a wonderful time with her. I didn't like the fact that she was a Republican voter, but I didn't say anything about that. Did my best to be as polite as possible. And you know, but she spent most of her life after the war raising kids, but also spending time performing at ladies' luncheons and things like that, coming back and forth between New Zealand. She had a Māori father, and Māori culture was a particularly important part of her identity and her sense of self in Los Angeles as well. But I really enjoyed my time spent with all of these wonderful families. So war brides were not typical migrants, but most in the end found it relatively easy to settle into American life. They sometimes struggled to integrate into American households, which they found were a bit more lively, open and less reserved than New Zealand ones. But for many, a sense of familiarity and belonging emerged with the birth of children, having a family, but also participation in community activities and especially joining the church, was a key kind of touchstone for many of these women. It kind of opened up the doors to community life for them and social connections. So my involvement in Mother's Darlings and the Pacific War Brides research then led me to think about homefront histories. And from this emerged the Te Hau Kāinga project, which I did with Lockie and Erica and a whole bunch of other people. So these are the covers of the books that will be out in November, which you can buy at any good bookstore. Lockie, who's fabulous, we all know that, did all of the translation work for the Māori language version, which is not an exact translation of the English version, so note that completely. Lockie, you're amazing. So this project has been like our heart and soul for the last few years. We've really enjoyed it. I think Lockie would agree, and I'm very sad to not be having our kind of team meetings anymore on Zoom. So World War II is often described by New Zealand historians as a watershed event for Māori because it ushered in a whole series of consequential shifts. Particularly notable was Māori urbanisation. That's one that gets talked about quite a lot. While the war was a watershed moment, accounts of transformation usually start from 1945 and often exclude any detailed examination of the war itself. So we've argued in our work that if we are to truly understand the impact of the war on Māori whānau and communities, then we need to connect accounts of overseas war service with the Māori home front itself. Reconnecting them is critical if we are to understand the wider impacts of the war on Māori society more generally in the 1940s, and it more accurately reflects the views of Māori leaders at the time who did not regard overseas service and the home front war effort as separate things, but our historiography often separates them. Part of our job is to try and reconnect them in this work. Now, there are numerous histories of the Second World War home front in New Zealand, and Māori are woven into these as part of a story of national collective endeavour. We were interested in the more distinctive components of the Māori wartime experience at home. And one of those important distinctive components of the home front effort was the establishment of the Māori War Effort Organisation, which Claudia Orange has written about quite extensively. Now, this was a government-supported but Māori-led collective of tribal communities and committees that mobilised Māori registration for service in the armed forces and for labour needs in industry and agriculture, so it had wide-ranging reach in Māori life. The spirit of autonomy, self-determination and Māori leadership in the MWEO built upon an already pre-existing tradition of this reaching back to the 19th century, and it infused every element of the war effort. And this included, for instance, I'm just going to give you a few examples before wrapping up. Desire for Māori control over patriotic monies raised by tribal committees, so that money could be directed to the support of their men or to organisations that they felt would care for them when they returned home. So not to the National Patriotic Collective Organisation, but to be delivered to the men personally, or to the Red Cross. So through the work of Te Puea Hirangi, who had very strong connections through the Red Cross. That was one of the kind of key components of her involvement in the Second World War, was to support that. And Māori raised huge sums, and they wanted control over how it was spent. Not too much to ask. Wartime fundraising was not just about supporting the home front, but it involved wider agendas relating to tribal mana, the promotion of pride and culture, and advancing claims to political autonomy. Leaders argued that the scale of the fundraising effort and the amount of money raised demonstrated Māori ability to organise at a national level across several fronts, and that this ought to be continued after the war. Another area was in agricultural production, which is really important in terms of the Māori story during World War II. Urbanisation has had a lot of attention in New Zealand history, but during the 1940s, most Māori lived rurally. Studying the home front war effort reasserts the significance of the rural world in Māori history, an often forgotten element. 75% of Māori were living in rural areas. They weren't urban, but we tend to focus a lot on the urban story in our history. During the war, Māori were a significant agricultural labour force, but they didn't want to be under the control of local production councils. They wanted to operate their own alongside these groups, but with the same level of autonomy. It meant being able to direct your own people, potentially retaining them within the region and preventing urbanisation in the future. And having your own primary production councils where you controlled how the land was used was also critical to preventing it potentially being taken by the government for defence purposes, which did happen, or for public works. It also meant growing foods that could be used for the national war effort and put towards community needs. Māori were integral to the provision and supply of food sources during the war, contributing with their land, labour and skills. They organised their own production committees to protect their land from alienation and to express their political autonomy. Māori also wanted control over rehabilitation services for returned Māori servicemen as well. They did not want it to be under the control of the Department of Native Affairs, later Department of Māori Affairs. That's because they were very well aware of the differential treatment their men had received in return from the First World War, and they sought to prevent the same outcome again. Tribal committees set up their own rehab sections and used that time to raise money in order to kind of gift that to men on their return, particularly those who came back disabled. It was really important that they had access to funds, or the provision of land if they could provide that as well. And the spirit of self-determination also spilled into other areas, such as desire for Māori autonomy and control within the mainstream kind of mission churches. And Lockie's got a fantastic chapter in the English language book that kind of discusses that kind of shifting debate about autonomy and self-determination around leadership within the churches itself. So the war itself was really suffused every element of kind of Māori life. So the war definitely, of course, impacted Māori whānau and communities, particularly those who felt the loss of their young men. But it also enhanced and strengthened the resolve for self-determination, which community leaders and Māori politicians sought to progress in multiple ways. Even if they weren't successful, they still sought to move forward with that. Some communities definitely lost their lands through it being taken for defence reasons, and others lost their young people who moved to the cities for work. But the larger transformations that came from the war were not immediate. They took some time to evolve. And they were a result of a kind of pre-existing set of government policies around land that limited the capacity for rural Māori communities to flourish at a time when the population was growing and was becoming more youthful. One of the key demographics of the war is that about 57% of the Māori population were aged under 21 in 1945. So it's a massively young population. This generation, who were young during the war, they might have been 6 or 7, something like that, or like my dad, born in 1943 during the war, and then grew up in its shadows, those are the ones who felt the full force of the transformation set in train by the Second World War. And I think that's that generation who were born or kind of experienced it as very young people who are kind of need to have some kind of thought given to them as a kind of historical cohort. And my concluding point is, and my final project that I want to mention is Te Takarangi, led by Jacinta Ruru and Jeanette Wakaira, with me on board as the third wheel. So this project is a celebration of Māori-authored non-fiction books published since the 19th century. As Jacinta has articulated many times before when discussing this project in public fora, it started as a way to challenge a perception that Māori were new to scholarly research and that books were not a part of Māori life, and that's just not true. So we compiled a select list of 150 books, now 180. It was published by the Royal Society. There was a big launch at Parliament for it. A taonga was created for that, carved by Len Heta. It's in the Central Library. Go and have a look at it. And it's in a book, yay, it's to be published next year by Otago University Press called Books of Mana. And this book has a series of very short reflections by an amazing collective of people about why Māori writing and Māori non-fiction books matter in past, present and in the future. So I contributed a chapter on the dedications and acknowledgements in the books on our Takarangi list, and I really enjoyed doing that, as Jacinta knows. And these things, these dedications and acknowledgements, have a lot in common with IPLs. Dedications, like an IPL, do many things. They greet the past, they pay tribute to those who've gone before us, and they acknowledge and greet special people in our lives. Thanks, Lockie. Acknowledgements, like an IPL, are an opportunity to recognise those people who advised, supported, cared for and lent their mana to a project. So many thanks to my friends, all my students past and present, and all my collaborators who have played a role in enriching my intellectual life. I've had a wonderful time doing research on all of these different projects. It's been a real joy doing this work. And in our mihi and in our acknowledgements in our books, we also set out our responsibilities to our readers, where we can be explicit about the aim of our book. Now, this might be to achieve social justice, to highlight historical legacies, to demonstrate Māori resistance and leadership, to create positive change, to pass on knowledge and to strengthen identity. One of the things I've aimed to do in my research is to bring out the variety of Māori experience in the past. And that's an experience that be centred in family and community. And to give mana to Māori women's narratives, which I hope I've achieved across my career, whether that's in the context of shore whaling and kaito communities or at a more national level during the Second World War. I've aspired to make a small contribution, a tiny contribution, to a weighty Māori scholarship that exists today. and I've aspired to hopefully play a role in inspiring the next generation of thinkers, writers and scholars. Because books are forever and always reaching a new audience, the future of Māori research and scholarship is full of endless possibilities. So I hope future historians will completely rethink, critique, extend and improve my work. So as you can probably tell from tonight's presentation, I quite like writing books, and here are some more of them. They are my preferred medium, and that's because I grew up with a lot of books. My dad, on days where he wasn't working, took us to the library to get lots of books out. We did that on a regular basis. My parents didn't have much money for buying books, but going to the library was a really important part of our life, and spending time with our dad as well, who we didn't see that much of. So they really are my preferred medium. I love them. That's because books are open worlds. They did that for me. They reach wide audiences, and I think that's what historians are their best at, communicating through books about our past, and they initiate new conversations. They are never the last word, but always the beginning of something new. Ka mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you very much for your time tonight.
Tēnā koutou, kia ora. It's great to see you here. Ko Jessica Pama tōku whenua, ko te mana kura o te kite aranui, tēnei. So as the Pro-Vice Chancellor of the Division of Humanities, in which we're very proud to claim history and Angela as a part of our whānau, it's my great pleasure to offer a vote of thanks. And I want to do that by pointing out just a couple of features of who Angela is and what her scholarship is that I hope kind of feed into what we've seen tonight. So the first feature I want to acknowledge and single out is, and it was, you picked up at the end, that is amazing scholarship. And it is wonderful to see. And it isn't just about writing a book. What sits behind all of that is incredible, detailed and careful analysis. It involves archival and oral histories. It involves thousands of conversations and research meetings and trips and never quite knowing what you're going to discover, and the painstaking work of bringing all that together. And in doing that, you're testing assumptions and you're testing received wisdoms about how we understand our world. And in so doing, Angela, you have helped to reveal more of our world to us, and to deepen our understanding of humanity, and particularly in your work, our understanding of the complicated relationships that make up humanity. You've done a whole lot, but you've shown the influence and centrality of Indigenous women on our national history. You have shown the connection between national and overseas service and the home front. You've shown how that made a significant impact on Māori collective organisation, on Māori political autonomy, on Māori self-determination. And those are all things that have added beautifully to our knowledge and understanding of who we are as a nation. So kia ora, thank you for that. Thank you for the huge amount of work that that screenshot represents. And secondly, I want to also acknowledge, and something that didn't come out in her address, and rightly so, but as PVC I want to acknowledge it, and that is that as academics, we play the role, we're often told, and it's in legislation, we play the role of critic and conscience of our society. But for some academics, playing that role means that we speak into areas and we voice opinions that sadly can become the target of unwanted, unnecessary, and at times appalling behaviour. And Angela, as an expert in feminine history and in Indigenous history and Māori history, and as her position as a wahine toa, has found herself in the line of some of those attacks. And that stuff we don't talk about a lot, and we work behind the scenes to reduce and prevent that. But I want to acknowledge you tonight for what that does at times, and how much it can cost you personally to continue on to bring this history out to us. It's not behaviour that we want to condone or tolerate in this university, and I want to thank you for your courage and your commitment to your discipline and to knowledge to continue on in your pursuit of knowledge for the rest of us. And I want to acknowledge too that a part of being able to do that every day and do it as well as you do it is that you have formed around you a community of support that you give to others and support that you receive. And you acknowledge that yourself, but I want to say thank you. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for the role you play in raising up other Māori academics and for the key part that you have played in the history program here at Ōtākau Whakaihuwaka. So kia ora, tēnā koe. So nō reira, whakamihi ki a koe, aho rangi, Angela Wanhalla, ka mihi nui mō tō mahi, mō tō whakaro, mō tō ako, mō tātou. I have the great pleasure of providing you with a wee token of our appreciation and also something that marks this evening and its significance. So kia ora. And to you, our audience, e te whānau, those online and those here in person, kanohi ki te kanohi in this room, a huge thank you. Thank you that your presence here is a sign of respect and affirmation for Angela, and it marks the fact that she is certainly a taonga for this university and for the humanities. So thank you for coming, and I invite you to join us over in the staff club now. It's just across the way. It's easy to get lost and disappear. Don't go to the staff club and join us for a cup of tea and some kai and a chance to celebrate and wish Angela all the best for these achievements. So kia ora tātou, thank you so much for coming, and pō Māori e.